What does a sculpture that pulses, oozes, gushes, and melts look like? It might be made of something as malleable as resin, or incorporate elements of raw spontaneity such as paper mache. Needless to say, what a work is made of influences the sort of impression we have of it. A material-driven process is often a labyrinthian maze, a rabbit hole to burrow down into. Artists often speak about materials having a life of their own. A sheet of canvas could sing to be stretched out, mud might resist the hand, and metal may perhaps whisper to be curved or looped around. Leaning into all of these murmurings, one arrives at a cacophonous riot of texture, color, sound, composition, and weight. Nabilah Nordin's works can be described as a smorgasbord for the senses. Her sculptures are luscious landscapes, gloopy messes, and spacious caverns all at once.
It always feels like a kind of an experimental lab where things are constantly failing me, but they're also working in some really weird or strange kind of way. I'm always trying to figure out how to use materials in a new way, even when it's store-bought materials like glue or fillers or certain types of wood adhesive glues, how to paint with them or sculpt with them and create a type of function that is so not what it's designed for.
Hello and welcome to the last episode of Mushroomed in this season. Mushroomed is a podcast hosted by the Singapore-based online platform Object Lesson Space. My name is Joella. I'm the founding editor of the platform and your host for this podcast. When I look at Nabilah's sculptures, I see the visual embodiment of words such as ooze and pulse. A series of works she presented recently at the Haider Museum of Modern Art in Melbourne is titled Bird Brush and Other Essentials. Nabilah's sculptures completely take over the gallery space, leaving no corner empty. Cloths and rags are strewn on the floor. Bulging, life-sized tubular forms lean against the wall, are propped up against one another, or stand in the midst of everything. Although the presentation is primarily floor-bound, the walls and ceilings have not escaped the artist's attention. Smaller pieces extend from the wall, including a slender lime green pipe. The work is extravagant, but full of contradictions. It resists the containment of the white cube gallery space, and at the same time, it sits within it with cool assuredness and confidence. This experimentation, and embracing almost of mess and clutter, is something that has become somewhat a signature of Nabilah's. Having said that, Nabilah isn't settling into a rhythm that's too comfortable. She constantly pushes the boundary of what sculpture can or should be. A series of works presented at Missing Persons in Melbourne exemplifies this. Cheekily titled Please Do Not Eat the Sculptures, audiences were invited to ignore the work's plea. Audiences were encouraged to literally eat off the sculptures as meringues, breadsticks, and cheeses were dangled precariously and balanced on receptacles incorporated into the sculptures. We wrap up the first season of Mushroomed with a conversation with Nabilah Nordin. We speak to Nabilah about her approach to experimentation and failure, and the place of language within her practice. in some way, it's really nice to kind of be having this conversation because, as you know, this is the last episode of Mushroomed in our first season of the podcast as well. So it's going to be a really nice way to wrap up the first season of the podcast. But yeah, so something that I've always done with all of our conversations is to ask our interviewees to spend some time thinking about the networks that they find themselves embedded within. And I want to kind of open up our conversation with a question around what you would say your earliest or most formative experience with art was.
Oh, okay. With art, it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because I feel like with art for me is representative of looking at the world and kind of responding to it in some way and interpreting it or expressing it, you know, whether it be through language or through cooking or drawing. It's a response. So I find it really hard to track back to when I first encountered art, and I think it might be because I have such bad memory. But yeah, maybe I've always enjoyed kind of drawing and colors, and you know, ever since I was a kid, I've always been attracted to objects or things that pop out in the world. And even through school, you know, I would always spend a lot of time decorating my books and wrapping and tearing up little pieces of paper and creating titles with them, and always being more interested in representing things visually rather than the writing component or like the content of something.
I think a lot of us can relate to that because the most exciting things as a child always are, I guess, the brightest or most vibrant things in the color box or in anything actually. I think things catch your eye as kids as well. And it's something that all of us carry around, I suppose, in one way or another, up to where we are today. And we started this conversation kind of looking at, you know, the earliest point as well. But I think something that I wanted to then bring us to is also your most recent solo presentation as well, Bird Brush and Other Essentials. And I think, you know, for me, I'm also encountering the show really by way of images on the internet as well, which is the best proxy that we have in these times, but still a proxy nonetheless. And I was struck by, you know, the cacophony of textures and how you're playing with different display heights. Some pieces are on the floor, some others are high up on the wall. And, you know, I think the real kind of contrast for me was really just how all of this was really set against how pristine or how white some of these gallery walls were as well. I was wondering if you could, walk us through a bit of your approach towards preparing for and putting these sculptures together. You know, in particular, I think because that contrast was so stark and clear to me, I also wanted to get a sense of whether there were particular elements of the museum or the gallery's architecture that you wanted the sculptures to respond to, push back against, stand in contrast to, or even be, you know, evocative of as well.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, when I'm setting up an exhibition, I'm always thinking about the space, and I'm always responding to how the space feels and how the works will connect and talk to each other in the space. So with the exhibition Bird Brush and Other Essentials, I wanted to create a sense of clutter and this kind of world really where things felt very large, but there were also very, very small details, and there was always more to discover as you walked through the space. I like this technique of clutter and this kind of this feeling where you forget where you are because there's just a lot of information and a lot of textures and things that are, you know, kind of disrupting your normal kind of view of the world. And so, yeah, I wanted to fill out the space as much as I could with sculptures or with installation components as a way to tie the works together. So for that show, I used a lot of rags that actually were scattered on the floor, but it crawled up onto the ceilings and all over the walls, and that kind of worked as a formal kind of composition as well for the space and for the works to link up to each other, because I didn't want each sculpture to stand as their own kind of thing necessarily. I wanted them to be connected to other parts of the installation. So yeah, clutter is always the kind of technique that I go for when I present sculptural installations like that. I feel like it's kind of the best way that I can draw people into another kind of world.
Yeah, I think clutter is such an evocative word as well, because when you said clutter, I think immediately the whole entire sort of presentation just boiled up to mind again. Like, I just saw all the images that I was looking at when I was preparing for the interview. And yeah, it was so reminiscent. I think it really encapsulates, the way in which perhaps someone might be searching for a word or searching for a term to really encapsulate that experience. And clutter really does that quite well.
Yeah, I mean, and I also think maybe it's just the kind of person that I am. Like, maybe I'm afraid of space, or like emptiness. Even the way that I live, I like to fill out space with lots of objects, things that I find or things that I've been collecting over time or things that intrigue me. I like to fill in space with objects. I don't know why, but it just fascinates me to be in clutter than be in a space where there's not much. It feels kind of lonely or empty to me.
Would you then kind of think of an empty space or like space devoid of clutter or objects within it as a blank canvas of sorts, maybe, or kind of like a blank slate for you to begin working on or thinking about how to kind of add to?
Yeah, I think the blank canvas and the white cube to me is just, it's nothing. It's just an empty kind of space. It's so untouched and anything can really happen. And I find that I'm more attracted to home spaces or gallery spaces or just things anywhere in the world that feels like it's been lived in, where it feels like someone's really, like a home is a good example, where people's kind of residues of life and the way that they are and how they kind of navigate around the world, all of that kind of excess is around them, and that's just part of living, part of life. And with the gallery spaces, sometimes it can be very cold and very, the very opposite of a home or somewhere comfortable where there's life has happened.
On that note about kind of words and terms as well, I also wanted to, I guess, come on to something else I noticed, which was, the way in which you use language, and in particular, I think also descriptive language as an extension of your practice. And because this really came to mind as I was reading through, some of the ways in which you describe your works as well. Words leave these indentations and impressions, and it's much like the process of sculpting or molding as well. There's a real intentionality around words such as ooze or gloopy, pulse, and melt, and they're really effective because they sound like what the sculptures look like as well. So I wanted to, I guess, maybe get a sense of what you would say the role or the place of such descriptive language is, both in the formation of your work and maybe also even in the eventual experience of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I find words really difficult sometimes, especially when it comes to describing sculpture or to describe art or to just describe anything that's visual. I find that words are never quite right. So I've recently been using more kind of descriptive words that feel a bit more textural or feel a bit more like an kind of action, you know, words like gloop is gloop or goopy or sometimes descriptive words like things like thick or chunky, because for me those words are stronger in my mind and I can kind of visualize what thickness might look like. It's clear enough, but it's open-ended enough for it to be many things. So I've kind of stuck to those types of descriptive words recently, because they stick more for me, but it's always difficult to kind of describe an artwork, I find.
Yeah, sometimes I also make up words to describe what something feels like, or the experience of things as well. And I wonder whether that's been something that you found maybe yourself tending towards as well, because sometimes things sound like a word that's made up, you know, something that completely does not rest in any dictionary, but you feel like maybe that encapsulates what you're hoping to achieve a little bit more.
Yes, I think that's interesting, this idea of like nonsensical kind of language that might sound like a texture but doesn't necessarily make any sense.
When we last spoke, you also briefly touched on the fact that you do enjoy the process of concocting up your own kind of materials as well. And this might take the form of you combining bits and bobs that you feel yourself drawn to and blending that into a paste and using that to form your works. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that as well. In blending materials together, what would you say you're trying to achieve through that process? And this could range from a likeness to something, an amalgamation of things, an essence, or maybe even something else altogether.
Yeah, I think it represents a kind of experimentation that never ends, when things that don't necessarily go together blend in some way. I think with sculpture, it's such a material, or for me, it's a very material kind of visceral practice. And with that comes, it's similar to cooking. You know, you have all of your different ingredients when you cook, and, you know, the ingredients list can kind of go on, and how those different ingredients interact with one another is always going to be unique to that moment in time. And I feel like with sculpture, it's similar, where it's always hard to kind of replicate a certain consistency or a certain type of texture, or the same kind of drying time. You know, things are always, you know, materials are alive. They're responding to so many factors, even in the environment. It's, you know, it's always every time I'm trying new mixtures, I'm always surprised by the results. But with these sort of pastes, I've been integrating lots of different types of materials together to create a kind of painterly, textural quality to really paint objects or three-dimensional kind of forms with. So I've used to use a lot of plaster and paper pulp, and I also use a lot of cement and sand. But recently I've been trying to kind of extend that construction, or that kind of bodily kind of materiality, into something else, because I don't want to just keep regurgitating the same kind of textures. So I've recently been introducing things like feathers, or different types of sands, or resins, and, you know, sometimes even food materials. Like I've been using macaroni as well in the sculptures, and hardening things with resins and encasing things. So it always feels like a kind of an experimental lab where things are constantly failing me, but they're also working in some really weird or strange kind of way. And yeah, I'm always trying to figure out how to use materials in a new way, even when it's, store-bought materials like glue or fillers or certain types of wood adhesive glues, how to paint with them or sculpt with them and create a type of function that is so not what it's designed for.
I guess also because experimentation necessarily means quite a bit of failure as well. But I wonder whether or not you could give us a little bit of an anecdote or example of how you know when an experiment kind of works, or when, something, putting two things together or three or four or five things together really creates this whole entire new perspective or new encounter that maybe was something that you completely did not envision or did not expect, but somehow it just came together and it worked.
Yeah, I think what for me, it's when something is finished, for me, is when it looks like it speaks of process. So if it doesn't show process, it is unfinished, because I want to kind of embrace that experimentation that happens and make sure that is visible in the work. And so then I can kind of talk about the process of making as the kind of endpoint, because it I guess for me it's a constant kind of evolution with sculpture. Things are constantly even with old works, things are constantly being remade into new works, and so the process is kind of never ending. And also I don't really like so much for things to be too polished or too contained or too solid or too aware of what it is. And I find that when there's elements and traces of the unknown or of things that didn't work or clearly broke or didn't look quite right, or there might be visible materials that have, like cardboard residues that are still left over on the surface, like those clues to me is kind of they feel like clues. It's like the residue of something being made still there, and I think that relates back to that idea of the space that's being lived in, where things, you can see the residue of someone's life, or you can see the residue of a moment, rather than it kind of being completely cleaned out and invisible and presented as another thing that doesn't show its real kind of essence of what it is.
Yeah, like a trail of breadcrumbs almost.
Yeah, exactly. There's because I cover as well a lot of the objects, there's a lot of hidden kind of things inside that people don't know. People don't know what's inside the objects because it's being encased in with these pastes and these kind of textures. So I like to kind of show process somehow in the full body of the sculpture. It is like it's like being a kind of detective sometimes in the studio, trying to regurgitate or find the insides of works and somehow bring it back out in the outer layer, and not just kind of clean it all off in this flat, shiny surface, but bring back the kind of the crumbly nature or the kind of haphazard or like the very haptic things that are happening actually in the core of it.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I also thought of a trail of breadcrumbs was really because I had some of your recent kind of works and projects in mind as well, including Please Do Not Eat the Sculptures. And in a way, I feel like, playing with how food is something that, well, when I was young, I was always told not to do. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about, what kind of inspired you to play with, in a literal sense, your food. And also, I guess also what you would say in some way the project represents for you also, particularly because it was so incredibly evocative. It's really fun. And it's something that I think people enjoy encountering as much as eating from as well. So yeah, like what sparked that whole entire experimentation or journey off for you?
Yeah, so I was asking a lot this question of what sculpture can do and how it performs. So with for example, armatures inside the sculpture, they support everything that's external from it. And so it acts as a kind of device and there's a kind of system involved in that. And then I was sort of then interested in it being more than just that, and whether it could act as a kind of support or a structure for people to come together, and whether it can become a type of entry point for humans to kind of interact and have special moments with. So I started to experiment with food as a materiality. Always in my mind, it would turn out into a more kind of a bigger project that involved artists and like people interacting with sculpture, because they could eat it or they could eat from it. And so sculpture kind of acted as a support or as an entry point for that to happen. And yeah, so it was the start of this whole COVID, and it was beginning of 2020, and I was living in a very kind of small house with my studio there as well, and everything kind of intermingled in one space. I was making art, but I was also cooking, and I was exploring these like food sculptures, and I was making costumes at the time, and I was also working, and my desk was everything was happening in one small space. And I just started with a few simple recipes, and then I kept going. Every week I would make learn how to cook a new meal, and I would always in my mind think of how that particular food would or could integrate with a type of sculptural support. So I actually, it was a new way of working, where sometimes I would be inspired to draw something, because I had to actually for the first time think about how sculpture can support something. So I had to think about having enough of a flat kind of surface area, so there would be enough space for some certain breads to sit on, or it would have to have lots of flat areas. So I had to think about how the armatures of the sculptures would be for the food. But it was always always morphing and changing as I was making it. So yeah, food was a really interesting kind of discovery. It really brought a lot of memories up for me as well. Like I started to think a lot about childhood foods that I liked, and I was always really excited to see how these ingredients would be able to look like a completely different thing to what it is. Like I use nuts in a certain way and chocolate in a certain way, where you couldn't quite tell whether it was chocolate or plaster. So there was a lot of ambiguity within the different materials.
In a way as well, because food has been something that a lot of us associate with particular kind of strong memories, or also it's just something that we all enjoy gathering around as well. It's such a nice kind of combination to have that at the center of something like, a sculptural piece, because in a way it kind of brings all of these things together to the fore for so many people as well.
Yeah, so then after that kind of experimentation happened, then it went into a new phase where I was hosting these dinners at home and inviting some guests, some artist guests to come and try out the food, but it would always be a kind of, casual kind of setting, and we wouldn't really necessarily know the artist who we were going to invite, and they didn't necessarily know each other. So it was sculpture in that instance became a kind of community building exercise, and it especially also because of the year that 2020 was. These dinners happened at the end of 2020, so people have been basically isolated and locked down and in their own kind of little bubbles, and so this project became a way for people to come together again and just remember what socializing was.
In many ways, food helps, or really provides a kind of reason for people to get together again, and eating together is like one of those communal activities that I'm sure a lot of us miss right now as well. But I wanted to also spend some time on perhaps, this is something that maybe the answer would seem a little bit too obvious for, but I also wanted to kind of dig a little deeper into the reason why food has become, the backdrop of choice for yourself for these intimate dinners and these small occasions as well, because we each have such a personal relationship to food, and it always brings up, really intimate memories for all of us. Why food at the center of something quite as important as this for yourself?
Well, I think food is it's so accessible, everyone understands food, and it in every culture there is food, so it is a very welcoming thing, and with these, my interest is with food was to actually, well, the first thing that I wanted to explore with food was its materiality, because that's the thing that I'm always trying to discover. But then that kind of naturally evolved into all these other things, and like these social gatherings, and it's taken lots of different forms. But yeah, the accessibility of food, and people can always connect with it in some way. It's a very personal thing, like you say, but it's everyone can share it in some way. They can share their experience with foods they like or foods they don't like, and yeah, these sort of dinners, I think it was a way to bring the kind of public into a personal space, because it was about me inviting people that I didn't know, or people just outside in the world, into my own home, and I would cook for them. So that in itself is a very kind of intimate and a personal kind of moment for me. So it was actually quite amazing to feel like my personal world or my personal space at home can be shared with others out there.
I suppose for some people, there always is kind of this idea around the home being a space for hosting, for bringing people you love together, for bringing guests together as well. But a lot of these dinners also featured guests that perhaps you might not be quite as familiar with, people that you were meeting maybe for the first time or just for the second or third time as well. And I think there's such a strong sense of community driving all of these sort of efforts as well. But in a way, I also wanted to ask a little bit more about what you would say drove really for yourself personally these sort of smaller scale initiatives as well, because they're incredibly small, incredibly personal, but also things that really, I think, would leave a very strong impression on people as well. People would probably think back on these sort of encounters as being incredibly authentic, and also things that would really help people to get to know one another better as well. In a way, I think also because these activities are so different to the usual gallery opening where there are hundreds of people, maybe not now with COVID, but there are a couple of people within a space and small talk might abound and things like that. I was wondering how you would describe these gatherings in relation to your own experiences. Were they coming from a particular sort of set of, I guess, encounters with people, or did you really see a need for these sort of also deeper connections between artists, between like-minded practitioners, and wanted to do something about that as well?
Yeah, I think I really felt, especially after the lockdown, I really felt a sense of a huge kind of desire to connect with others again. And I feel like, as an artist, it can be, you do your own thing, and it's quite an individual kind of journey sometimes. Like, it can be very public because you have shows and it's, you have openings and things like that. But all of those moments to me feel very quick and sometimes can be transactional and a bit repetitive, and you end up kind of seeing the same faces, and you don't really kind of go beyond that unless you really make an effort to. So I was talking with my partner Nick, who's also an artist, and we both just had this kind of desire to bring more people into our life and grow a kind of, I guess just grow the art community in some way where people could get to know each other in a more meaningful way that was beyond just the gallery openings. And of course everyone is so incredibly busy with life, and it's really hard to commit to something. So with these dinners, it was always like a month in advance. We had it planned. It was we sent out the invites really early on just to make sure that people could be there and really commit to being there. And it's hard. Everyone has such busy lives, to actually meet new people and to connect, especially with other artists. I find, I'm so inspired by artists, and I want to know more about them and how they think and what they do, and I want to know more about their life. But it is hard to make and build these connections if if I don't put in effort and make it happen, it's never going to happen. So that was the kind of drive at the start, to do something where people could come and we could share something together. That was always the kind of goal.
And that's such important work as well, because I think meaningful conversations and really authentic connections are things that do require a certain level of intentionality around them.
Yeah, because I guess we live such structured lives that even, to have moments where we can play or where we can connect in some other way, it has to also be structured within the structure of life. So it's hard for, spontaneous things to just happen.
But sometimes they do, and when they do, they're great.
Exactly. It's always amazing when it does.
I just had one final question, and hopefully it wraps up the conversation in a way that brings the focus back to your own art making processes as well. We've been kind of skirting around it, but in a way, the pandemic and COVID has really kind of made a lot of what we do, or what all of us are interested in doing, really hazy and loopy and very dreamlike in some ways as well. And given this context, I'd be interested to know what sort of materials, colors, textures, or even feelings you found yourself being drawn to or excited by these days.
Well, I think recently I've been attracted to more colors. Like I haven't been I've been a bit more pared back in the last year with color, where I was a bit more restrained, I think, because I always wanted to create and I like an image of something where it tied together. It wasn't just all the colors at once. It was considered, and things could pop out and things could stand back, kind of like a painting, you know. So the way that I think about making these sculptural installations is a lot like a painting. But recently, yeah, I've been looking and thinking a lot more about bolder colors, and I think, I don't know, maybe it's yeah, I don't know why, but yeah, this kind of vibrant, you know, vibrant greens and purples and rich kind of colors have been really, yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'm seeing it a lot as well.
Like just neon bright colors as well?
Not so much like neon, like bright fluoro, but more just richer colors with like not brighter, but maybe more of more pigments, not pastel but vibrant. And I don't know why, but I feel like maybe it's probably not the mood that everyone is in right now. And it feels like I don't know, it's maybe it's joyous, or it's kind of optimistic about something in the future, or maybe hopeful for the future, which is not, I don't, I mean, as a person, I don't ever really think so much about the present. I'm always very future focused. And so even with thinking about making art, I'm never thinking about what's currently happening now, but where something can be, you know. It's a very, very difficult time at the moment, and I think I don't like to think about the moment so much right now. I'm thinking more about the future and being future focused, like I always am.
Nabilah Nordin is an artist interested in how sculpture acts as an entry point for material experimentation, social gatherings, and ways of embedding art and life. If you'd like to learn more about Nabilah's works, you can visit her website at www.nabilahnordin.com. This episode is the last within our first podcast season. We've really enjoyed the entire process of making these episodes, and we hope you've enjoyed the conversations on Mushroomed as well. You can find more articles and transcripts from these podcast episodes on our website, www.objectlessons.space. Mushroomed is a podcast series hosted by Object Lessons Space and produced in collaboration with the wonderful people at Singapore Community Radio. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.